It's actually a good time, as Carrie mentioned, that I recently left the company. So before we wasn't kind of allowed to talk about anything relating to numbers or strategy. I'm not going to talk about numbers or strategy neither. But I just feel like when you're an outsider, maybe it's easy to talk about it. And within the scope of about 10 to 12 minutes, I'm just gonna share some very personal insights. So basically, I put that as a headline just because the whole fashion e-commerce is really about making people to trust you enough to try, like, so that I can dress you online without trying on anything. Because basically, my e-commerce experience is really about fashion. So this is I normally receive two questions very often when I introduce myself as a head of marketing at Zalora. And the first one is, how much money you're spending? That always comes up. And the second one is, when is Zalora closing? And it's funny because the first question always come up in 2015, and the second one only surfaced in 16. And is it a coincidence that people was asking how rich you are, and then they're asking, are you dying? And the next coming, I'm just going to share about a few key points, which I think is a good way to kind of demystify these two initial questions. And this is purely from my background, which is Zalora, and also I was coming from a very different background in banking and finance. I was trading foreign currency, and previously I was doing investment as well. So 20 months in Zalora was very useful in the way that it brings this very different perspective. And when I reflect with the questions that people ask, this is the three things that came up. So cash burn is the first one. It is actually a phrase that you use in e-commerce a lot. And basically it means that you burn cash to acquire customers. And what I find is normally the people from traditional and offline industries find that the cash burn rate is super surprising, simply because they were assuming that e-commerce is a cheaper way to earn sales and revenue, when actually it's not, because you are looking at an entirely different model. I mean, I'm not going to go into details, but that's the first one that I always talk back when people ask, is Zalora dying? And then I always ask back, why do you think that is? And then people knowingly, without working in e-commerce, always say that, because it's a dying model, and secondly, because so many companies closed last year. So that's the first thing I always mention. The second thing is about brand building, which I think is very fortunate thing for me for working in Zalora as a head of marketing, because unlike the normal kind of rocket internet style where you have to spend on a very order or revenue oriented way, we actually had the chance to spend a lot on brand building, which sometimes doesn't return immediate orders. For example, you pay for fashion shows and celebrities and that kind of stuff, which in a span of 3 to 6 months, we do see the return. But in a rocket environment, it is very difficult to argue that you're going to spend 5K or 10K on a fashion show with some, celebrities, and you don't see any orders coming in. And this is a part where I find it's very interesting, again, for me to learn both the e-commerce data-oriented way and also the brand building in a traditional setup. That's the second part. And the third part, customer loyalty, is where I think both is not being paid enough attention within the e-commerce environment, because most of the time we trying really to acquire and gain market share and worry about the repeat and the repurchase a bit later on. And that also comes back a little bit with the brand building part, where customer loyalty is really what gonna help you to survive. Even though, I mean, e-commerce is a scale game, but at the end of the day, are people gonna come back to you? And it really relates to the cash burn and the brand building in a way that in e-commerce is well known that you discount and you give people vouchers to try for the first time, but it also is a losing game in the long term, because people come to you just because they get a vouchers or free offers, and in the long term, would they come back? And I think that's the third point that I want to make about these three differentiations point, that every time people from e-commerce, non-e-commerce background ask me about like how the spending and all that. And which come to the second thing. when Carrie was asking me about my thoughts on the future of e-commerce, which I don't think I'm in the position to answer, but these are the two factors that, from my experience, this is really the winning factors. The first one is a team thing. Of course, it's always important to have a good team to execute your strategy, your plan. But what I observe is that when you compare a traditional marketing team execution versus an e-commerce team, it is a very different mindset because one, e-commerce people think in a 30-minute time slot. Because in a 24-hour campaign, if you lose 1 hour, you already lose like nearly 4 or 5% revenue. Or in a campaign that lasts a week, you lose a day, then you lose about 15%. So in a traditional marketing setup, people think in 3 to 6 months span, which is, ridiculously long for e-commerce setup. So in order to have a team that can really execute and at the speed of e-commerce, I think it's really important with the coordination. For example, in the online fever, which is the biggest campaign during the year for e-commerce company like Zalora, we had a day, the 12/12, where the revenue actually like 28 times a normal day, and the whole winning was we changed the campaign plan just 1 hour before the launch, and without coordination, without that kind of speed and aggressiveness, I don't think it's ever going to be possible to pull that off. And that is why I mentioned team, because there's a huge difference in terms of speed and execution. The second part is the omni-channel. I mentioned this because I actually had the chance during the transition where maybe you heard about it, Central Group acquired Zalora Vietnam, and in a span about 6 months, we actually had the chance to see how Zalora was moving into this omni-channel. We actually have our brands, our private labels brands, in Central Group kind of malls and stores and vice versa. So Central Group actually owns a bunch of fashion brands as well. They have all that coming on Zalora. And I do believe that this is really the future of fashion e-commerce in a way that if you can and if you really have the capability to, you have to go omni-channel. Because this is where it goes back to the 3 factors that I mentioned earlier. It helps to leverage and reduce the cost of acquiring customers. It leverages the brands that you're already building and all that, brand loyalty and repurchase. So yeah, that's my key points. I just have some quotes that I think I really like, and it kind of reflects what I just mentioned if you didn't really pay attention at all. So this is Elon Musk. He was saying that don't create companies for the sake of creating, but getting things done. And I think this is an example where either it's a rocket thing you create to sell, or you create to sustain, and you sell later, which some of my friends do. The second one is data. Data is a guy from Siloxome, which I think this is one of the biggest things that I learned from 2 years in e-commerce. And it's the biggest thing that I can apply in other industries. And the third one is, I think it's really relevant from the guy that created this famous Warby Parker, have you heard of? The online store for glasses, which no one believed that it's going to work. He and many people actually think that e-commerce is going to be no longer a word. We're just going to say commerce. It's not going to be e. So yeah, that's my part.